In this session of BimlFlex, we're going to be looking at importing files and how to configure your files in BimlFlex. What we're going to be covering is we're going to just quickly go through the BimlFlex workflow again. Then we're going to look at the sample file structure that we're going to use in this demo sessions. We're going to look at how to configure the file connections. We can configure the projects, the objects, and the columns. And I'm going to demonstrate to you how to do all of this in BimlFlex. So first of all, once again, let's quickly look through the BimlFlex workflow just so you can see where it fits in. Normally what we do is we point BimlFlex Excel add-in at a data source and we import the metadata from there. We've already configured our connections, projects, and batches. However, we're going to start again. We're going to go and say, well, when you work with files, there's no real machine metadata that you can import. And when I show you the samples, you'll see what I mean. But we're going to be taking the BimlFlex metadata and manually enter that into the spreadsheet. That metadata is then going to go up to our metadata repository, and then we're going to not use our Data Vault Accelerator today, but again we're going to use Biml Studio to open it up and build out our BimlFlex project for the file imports. We're going to run that, but we're not going to deploy that today. Let's have a look at our accelerated development environment and again have a look at what we're going to cover and where this fits in. First thing we're going to do is we're going to look at data sources, right? We're not going to be looking at a database system. We're going to look at flat files here, but we are going to go from a source and we're going to configure our metadata to a staging environment. We're not going to look at persistent staging area today, and we're not going to be looking at the data vault. However, the files that we import, the same rules apply that if you define the business keys and relationships on the files, you can use that to either go to a data vault or straight to a dimensional model. So the files, as soon as the metadata is inside of BimlFlex, it is the same as any other metadata that you will be using. So let's have a look at the sample file structure here. So I'll just create two dummy files here from the AdventureWorks LT database. The one on the left hand side is just a product.txt file. And what I've done there is I've pipe delimited it and I have included the column names in the first row. The second file there is the product category file. And again, what I've done there is I've made it comma delimited and I've excluded the column heading, so to speak, just so I have two different files that I've got some sample files with this. So the first thing we need to do is we need to look at configuring the file connections. When you set up the file connection, you need to provide it a name, and I tend to put the word FF in front of it so I can know that it's a flat file. You give it the name. Generally, it's the name of the entity you're trying to import, which is the product and the product category, and then I abbreviate it by SRC just so that I can kind of, when I look at the name, I know what is source connections and I know what is other types of connections. So I put SRC in. The connection string is just it's not really relevant because it gets configured again, but it's good to then give that the name or the location of where the sample file is. So I've got product category and product there, and as we go through the project you'll see that it could actually just be any kind of configuration there. The catalog is really only used when you do file exports, but again you tend to give it the same name, and in that case there I should have called the one product category and one product, but I've given it product. The connection type is a file. The system type is file delimited. There is other file types like ragged write, but we're not going to go through that. That's a very exception, and I've only really had to use that once in my experience. We define the integration stage as source, and then if we go to record source here, now this is where it gets interesting because this is part of the AdventureWorks project, and I want to really model this into the same. And I'm going to be talking about Data Vault here real quick. I want to model this to the same, and it's the same record source. So you could have a system where some of the files you might get directly from a database, other files you might get from a system that has exported a flat file, but they actually come from the same source system. So you can give them the same record source, and I have done that here. And the reason I've done that is to show you some of the things you need to be aware of if you do give files the same record source as your source system there. And then here it becomes a little bit more important, the file path. You can give this, and this path, and I'll show this in the demo, where we can override this file path and make it parameterized. And then the file pattern, again, you know, if it's going to be in a file folder, we're going to do a for each file loop on this and say, get me every file that is of this pattern. Now, once we've configured this, and I'll show you this, and we set the metadata at this connection level, even when we just in Excel add in, we'll get a validator error that says, well, you haven't defined the file format and the file format is invalid. And the reason for that is a file connection has to be associated with object and column metadata. In other words, you can't have a file connection, and in SIS this is the same thing. You can't have a file connection and not define what the file structure looks like. So when you get this validator, just ignore it until you obviously provide other metadata. However, if you were to set this metadata and then refresh your metadata, or close the spreadsheet, open it up, refresh it again, this metadata will disappear, and I'll show you that in a minute. And the reason why that is because the metadata is in actual fact invalid. What we do is we mark this as a logical exclude from build. So we say, well, you know, otherwise we'll get a whole bunch of errors further down the track. We'll exclude this from build so that you can add that later on. So just be aware of these kinds of things here. Once you've configured the file connections, you need to configure a batch, which I'm going to show in the demo, but it's not really relevant. So we'll jump on to the projects here. When you configure projects, you have to define because a project is not just a project, it also defines the source to target connections. And because every file has its own source connection, we have to define a project per file. As you can see there, I've defined two projects, extract FF product and product category, and I have then set them up to go to the staging database and then to the data vault and just source to target. However, because I want to have these two separate files be part of a parent project, so they kind of become, they are part of the same batch and same project, we then define a project and we assign the parent project to that. And again, I'll show that to you. When we configure the objects, a couple of things to note here, and I'm going to go in the demo, I'm going to show you some of the stuff here. The schema and the object name here is actually the schema that you want the table to be called inside of the staging layer. So because I'm going to have a product coming out of AdventureWorks and a product category comes out of AdventureWorks, I now have a flat file that is also going to be called product and product category. So therefore I want to put it in a different schema. And you got to have to play around with things a little bit here, and I'll go through the use record sources schema, append schema stage, and show you what those mean when we do the demo. But for now, just sort of they're there for information. And then what I do is I go in and I start configuring things like, well, the one file, the product file had the column name. So I say, yep, it's got the column names. And where it doesn't have the column names, you can just leave it blank. The default is no. The flat file type, we want to say that it's delimited. And those flat file types correlate to the same flat file types that you'll get in SIS. It'll be delimited, fixed width, and ragged right. They're both delimited. The one is pipe delimited, the one is comma delimited. So again, on the column delimiter, I go and set vertical bar and comma. The row delimiter, in other words, at the end of the row, there'll be a control, a carriage return, and a line feed. And then the last column delimiter, if you leave that out, it's good to define it. Normally that is the same as the row delimiter, but in some instances it could actually be different, especially when you're working with ragged right files. It could be different. You have to set the code page, which is 1252. There is also another attribute on here which I'm not showing, which is called is Unicode, and the is Unicode one is what you'll define if the file coming in is Unicode, and that's when you work with UTF-8 files and files that are actually got Unicode characters in them. Configure file columns. This is the bare minimum configuration that you need to stage the data. The first is, again, when I show the demo, I'm just going to paste predefined columns in there, but effectively it's the same as defining everything. You just have to define the column names, the data types. It is best practice when working with flat files to try and keep the data type string, but you can define them as integers. In another demonstration or video, I'll talk about data type mappings, where you can define all of your data types as ANSI string to make sure that at least you get the file into your staging environment. And then from there, you can say, do data type mappings that converts those data types going into your next layer, like a data vault or data mart will convert them into the right data types. As a bare minimum, you have to, for every object inside of BimlFlex, you have to have one business key and at least one primary key. You can have multiple primary keys, but you can only have one business key. So you have to, when importing a flat file, know what is the file, what is the column that drives the primary key on this thing, and that's required for the staging layer. So as a bare minimum, that's what it is. So I'm going to go ahead now and show you a demo. All right, so in this demo, I'm going to start from the beginning here and set up a file connection here. So as I showed you before, we need to provide it a name, a connection string here. I'll just do that and then expand all of this out. We have to have a connection string here, and I'm just going to go and fix this up right now. So I'm going to call it category. It's a file. It's a file delimited, as you got to see. There's a lot of different, you got drag it right there, but it's file delimited. It is the source, and I've got my AdventureWorks LT here. I have to find the file path, and I'm going to go and set current sheet here. And as you can see here I've got my two errors. Remember when I said that if you're setting up a flat file and you don't have any metadata here, you'll get these two errors here that will say, that says to you, you need to define a file format. In other words, you need to set up the object and the connections for that. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go and do get current sheet. So what you'll see here is when I get the current sheet here, and let me just, I'm going to go and untick the show excluded, just so you may be working in this space here, and then you go get current sheet, you go, well, where did my connections go? And the reason why that is the case is because obviously, as I said, is once you get into Biml Studio, if you have half entered metadata, we need to exclude that from the metadata set so that you don't get build errors in your Biml Studio. So if this has happened to you, just go and click show excluded, and then say get current sheet again, and then you'll see your file formats here. On batches here, again, I'm not going to go into this in a ton of detail. I'm effectively just going to create a batch here that's going to load my flat files here. I'm going to use orchestration, number of threads is 0. You really need to leave the 0, I think, in files, because you're going to be importing one file at a time. And then in projects, it gets a little bit more interesting. And again, what I'm going to do here is just open this up for you so you can see. So what I have done here is I've created a file per source connection, and then associated to a parent project. And the rest of the settings are really the same. When you're working with a parent project, it doesn't really have a source connection because it's just a grouping of sub ones here. So just for the source connection, just give it the same name as the staging connection. I've given them all the same batch because I want one batch, one project with multiple project flat files to be exported. Again, set current sheet here. Head over to the objects, and I'll just go back to the front here, and on these I'm just going to go and insert the projects here, the objects here. Again, it's per project, per connection, because flat files is slightly different to tables, because for tables you can have many different objects belonging to the same connection, like a database. In files it is one by one, and I have AdventureWorks LT flat file. That's the schema, and that's all you need to do. Don't worry about the rest of the stuff that you need to set on this side. So now we head over here, and we're going to actually go and configure this. Let me make some more real estate here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, I know that the product one here, this has got the it's got the column names in the first row. It's both they are both delimited. I don't want to skip any rows. 0 is the default. Text qualifier, I don't have a text qualifier. Text qualifier you use in the context of, let's just say you've got a CSV file that actually has got commas inside of the tables. Quite often you'll get a file that says, oh, I've got a double quotes is delimiting my is my text qualifiers. Row delimiter here, again, I'm going to make this control line feeds, because that's the in my files it is. Column delimiter on the first one here is a vertical bar, and on the last one here is a comma. The last column delimiter, again, I'm going to just make a control line feed again, and you do need to provide a code page, which is 1252. And then here is the ease Unicode. So if you were to get it, so these two obviously mutually. So if you've got a Unicode, you tend to not have a code page unless you know what it is. So I'm going to go set current here, and again, I'm just going to show you the errors here. The errors here effectively says that I now have an object. Remember, the file format one is gone now, but I now have objects that doesn't have columns. So these errors are actually saying to me, I need a business key for every table because I have no columns. I don't have a business key. And then this one is saying, is a warning saying that you have a table without any columns. So let's go ahead here and setting the columns here. And again, I'm just going to go and paste in the columns that I've prepared earlier. So as a minimum, I need to have all of my columns and types here that I've entered. And again, I need to have a primary key here for both of these and a business key. That is my bare minimum there. And after I've done that, as you'll see here, I've got no more validations here. I'll set my current sheet. And then I'm going to head over to Biml Studio and just refresh the metadata just to show you exactly what that looks like right now. So again, I've got an empty project. I'm connected here. I've got a project here with no tables. and connections. So if I refresh this, I'll get in my file. So I'll get my two tables here that I'm going to go stage. So there I've got my two tables that I want to stage, and I'll have my package dropping in here. There's my file formats, and I'll have my package in here, coming in here, and the project will come in shortly, and the batch. So there's the batch and there's the project to load these two file formats. But remember what I said to you, that I may have already imported, or I'm not going to import it right now, but I may already have the product and the product category belonging to AdventureWorks LT. You see how this schema name here is not actually the schema name of the record source, and that's because of that setting called use record source as schema, which means is that it'll use the record source as a schema in the staging layer. Well, I don't want it in this instance here. However, I'm going to head over to my settings and just show you where these settings are, and then how we're going to get around that. As you can see here, here is my setting here, which says use record source as schema. Yes. Now this is a global setting saying, well, every single source connection that I have, for that source connection, I'm going to use the record source as a schema. Now that is going to be true except for these two things. How do I override that? Well, we have got this ability for you to go into custom attributes, which is sort of a place where you can override any of these settings. Now this, just going to go and paste that in there, and I'll show you what it is. So what we can do here is we can say, the first bit here, which says use record source as schema, is the configuration that I want to override, and I want to go and override its configuration value. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying I want to go and target this at configuration key, and I want to go and define a custom value for this. You can define a custom value for any one of these configurations. Now, in all of the projects that I've worked with so far, we've done this maybe 2 or 3 times. The functionality is there, and the flexibility is there to do this, but you will use this very seldomly. So again, I'll just paste another one in there, and I'll actually set this and saying, well, I want to do this for that source connection and for that source connection there. So now what I'm going to do is for these two source connections, I'm overriding that value. I'll set current sheet now, and I'll refresh the metadata. When I refresh this, I want to see AWLT_FF coming in here as my schema name instead of AWLT, which means is I can actually stage it in a different schema, but I can still use the same record source when I load it into my data vault. So as you can see there, yep, it's just come through and just changed the schema names around real quick. So that's just a neat little feature there. So now that I have this, I can now just go ahead and build out the project. So I'm going to go ahead and build out the project, and then open it up in Visual Studio and show you what's been built out as standard. And then we're going to go in and tweak a couple of things here. All right, so the build has been successful. I'll head over to Visual Studio here. Yes, I'll reload it. What you'll see here is we've got one project, one batch, and inside of that batch is going to call 2 different files. Let's open up the product file here. I'll just show you what we're doing there. Is you'll see here it's just going to load a very basic flat file. It does a for each loop container, and inside of this for each loop container, it'll look at a collection, and there is my directory or my folder, and here is the path that I've set, or this says. You'll also see by default I've got this sort of directory here called project import path, and that is set by default for everything that we have a file. We'll add a variable called import path here. It may also be a situation where actually you want a little bit more control over parameterizing your flat files. So what I mean by that is what if you wanted to add some additional expressions here, whatever those expressions may be. You may have a requirement for those. Sorry, I was going to try and get this here. So you may want to add another expression here, or you change this expression, or you may want to change this variable here of this thing. So let's go ahead and show you 2 extension points to do that real quick. So if you think about this from a SSIS point of view or integration service point of view, is I want to add a project parameter here that is possibly another project parameter that I want to define, and then I want that project parameter to be used as a directory and not the one that is defined by default. Okay, and by the way, where it gets that default one from is there will be, again, in the configurations, there is an import path in here, somewhere over here. Let me just get it. Import path in here, which will be your global import path. Now again, You may be working with multiple projects, so therefore a global import path may not be what you want. Again, you can either set it by the attributes, go and override it, or do what I'm about to do here, is add 2 extension points. So the first one I'm going to do is add an extension point here, which is going to be on a project level. I want to add a project parameter here, and let me just zoom in there a little bit here. And the first thing I want to do here is just take this out, because I'm going to add another project parameter here. Remember, when you're adding project parameters, you need to define a target. And I'm going to be targeting, let me just go in here. I'm going to be targeting this project over there. So the first thing I want to do is target the project here. And I'm just going to go ahead here and then put in the project name there. And then I want to add a parameter. And the parameter I'm adding here is just called my import path. And I'm just giving it C BimlFlex import. And that's actually where I've put the files into my local directory here. So I'll save that. The next thing I want to do is I'll say, well, I want to now associate the expression of the for each file loop with this import path here. So again, head over to my extension point here, and I'll add a source file loop extension. And again, I'll take this out here. I'll just remove the things I don't need. And I'm actually going to go ahead here and target the flat file. So I'm actually targeting the batch. I don't want to target these individual files. I want to say all of the files that belongs to this batch, I want to go and associate this. So what I then need to do is I actually need to say this object inherit, in other words, inherit this extension point from the batch, inherit it down, or if I'm at the project level, look at the batch and inherit it down there. And what I'm going to do there is I'm going to go and say inherit it, and then the expression of the directory, the property name directory, give it my project file import. Okay, so just a quick easy way. I'm just going to go and refresh things here, and then I'll build it out again. And after I've built it, I'll go back into Visual Studio, and I will show you what then has happened with this project parameter and the source file expression coming in there. Let me go ahead and build this out. All right, so the build has been successful. I'm going to go over here to Visual Studio. Yes, reload all. And again, I'm just going to open up the product, which is opening up by itself. So the first thing we'll see here is if I look at the project parameters, you'll see here that I've got my import path is coming in here right now. Go to the product, open up the for each file loop container, go to collections. You'll see that this is configured because I have my expression now is pointing to project my import path. So that just shows you once again the flexibility of using BimlFlex as a framework, that you can configure it. It gives you all the defaults you want. So out of the box, if you don't change anything, it'll work. But when you do need to change it, we give you the power to decide where and what you want to change within the framework. So once again, just thank you for your time. And I hope to see you in the next video BimlFlex training session.